Welcome. I'm Jenny Gibbs, Executive Director of the IFPDA and the IFPDA Foundation, and this is Print Month. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to all of our collaborators at the many museums and institutions with whom we've partnered to present this month of programming. This is the fourth year in which we've expanded the live and virtual programming of what was for more than 20 years Print Week into a month. Today is the first of 3 weeks of virtual programs, Tuesday through Thursday at 12 noon Eastern. Print Month culminates with the IFPDA Print Fair and live programs at the Jacobsz Center in New York, October 26th to the 29th, with programs featuring artists, curators, and printmakers, including Ed Ruscha and curators from the Met, MoMA, the Whitney, and more. The IFPDA Book Award, which we're presenting today, was founded in 2004 to highlight and promote research and scholarship in the field of prints, editions, and printmaking. And today we're very honored to recognize the recipient of the 2023 IFPDA Book Award, Paper Knives, Paper Crowns, Political Prints in the Dutch Republic, edited by Maureen Warren, who will be more fully introduced along with her guests by our friend and colleague, Armin Kunz, who served on the jury which selected this year's recipient. Armin describes himself as, quote, a lapsed art historian specializing in the German Renaissance and Romanticism. He is currently making a living as a print dealer and owns the venerable dealership of C.G. Berner, which was founded in 1826 and could therefore, he says, with a bit of luck, soon be preparing for its bicentennial in 2026. Before I turn the program over to Armand and Maureen, just a reminder that we will be taking questions and answers at the end of the program. If you can type them into the Q&A box, and we will address them. The program may run slightly longer than an hour. If you need to leave, it is being recorded, and it will be available in the coming weeks on our YouTube channel. And with that, I'm delighted to turn the program over to Armin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jenny, for the introduction. And it is my great honor and pleasure to officially announce to everyone that the winner of this year's book award, IFPDA Book Award, is Maureen Warren, who edited this fabulous catalog here called Paper Knives, Paper Crowns, as you can see this way around as well, Political Prints in the Dutch Republic. This book accompanied a fabulous traveling exhibition that was shown first at the Krannert Museum, where Maureen is curator of European and American art, and then traveled to San Diego, and I think is now or will be very soon at his third and last stop at Tallahassee. As a curator of European and American art, Maureen has, in a smaller museum, she pretty much has to be a jack of all trades, or Jacqueline of all trades, if you wish. So in her position there, she curated exhibitions on medieval manuscripts, on even white ceramics, Dutch ceramics, political prints, of course, like this show, but even on contemporary Japanese ink paintings. I want briefly, the two other participants in today's panel, both are contributors to the book. One is Daniel Horst, who is a researcher at the history department at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Daniel is actually a really sort of old hand in this subject matter, because if I'm looking from the American perspective, he was the co-curator of an exhibition back in 1993 called Images of Discord, Graphic Interpretations at the Opening Decades of the 80 Years War, which sort of was the first really wider public sort of exhibition that dealt with the subject matter. Meredith Hale is currently a lecturer in art history and visual culture in Exeter, England. And she will later sort of introduce some of the subjects that she will, that her essay featured in the book as well. What I would like to say and give a little bit of a reasoning of our jury at the time for awarding the prize to Maureen is that we felt, in addition to this being a really beautiful produced book, which is full of, which gives a wonderful review of existence research and makes valuable new contributions to the subject, it is actually also a show, and quite rare at that, which with historical material manages to show an incredible actuality of the subject matter, meaning prints or images used as propaganda. I always felt that the shows back in 1993 at Bryn Mawr, and then there was a really important show at the Deutsche Historische Museum in Berlin in 1997 called Krieg der Bilder, War of Images, which dealt also with propaganda images in the absolutist age, that these shows felt always a little bit like they're dealing with historic material with a time that is kind of like way far off, way behind. There is always this idea, propaganda always had this feeling of being something of the past, something that you associate with totalitarian regimes of the mid-20th century, and of course going backwards all the way to the 17th century or the 16th century if you think about the German Reformation. But we are now living in a time where basically this whole idea of propaganda and image propaganda is prevalent and actually omnipresent. And I think it becomes very clear in the title that Maureen had chosen for the exhibition version of her subject, which is Fake News and Lying Pictures, because this is really what virtually everything in today's media is about. So there is suddenly as I said, an actuality to this historic subject. And what Maureen did in the catalog, and especially also, I think, in the exhibition, she kind of made these links very clear. And this sort of idea of bringing historic material and interpreting it in our contemporary world, I think was done in a really convincing way, and in a way that hardly ever felt, or actually never really felt, forced, because all of these terms that we use now, starting from this horrible term fake news all the way to even memes and things like that, what we face on the internet every day, are things that can be easily seen in this material. And then lastly, on Maureen's role in this as a curator is also that she manages, in the roughly decade that she is now out in Illinois at this museum, to actually build a really surprisingly good collection of this material. And she achieved that, of course, with institutional support, but at a relatively small museum, which now can probably claim of having one of the most comprehensive collections of this sort of propaganda print material here in the United States. And lastly, as someone who is a dealer, mostly, of course, what we normally refer to as fine prints, just for the mere fact that these propaganda prints that were used, like the posters are used today, are incredibly rare to find. What also struck me is that you go to this exhibition, you learn the historic context, you learn the relevance of this material for us today, and only at the very end of being sort of enthralled by this exhibition, you realize, wait a minute, I've just looked at an exhibition of 17th century Dutch prints where Rembrandt, that kind of uber artist which dominates every other exhibition, and every other exhibition which has a Rembrandt in it was probably called From Rembrandt to, or From There to Rembrandt, to bring in the crowds, that show actually managed, to make do with only a few Rembrandts, which some were relevant for the show, others were, even by Maureen's admission to me, kind of like a bit of eye candy, sort of for the regular public. And so with this praise of this catalog and the show, I'll hand it over to Maureen now. Thank you.
Thank you, Armin. What a generous introduction. And thank you for your support of this project from the research days onward. I'd like to begin with a long list of thanks, so if you'll indulge me, this project never would have happened without a lot of outside support. First, I'd like to thank the IFPDA for this award. It's an incredible honor. I never would have expected to be on a list with some of my great printmaking scholarship heroes. And I can only attribute that to having been fortunate enough to get my dream team of collaborators. If you look at the list of folks who submitted essays, I mean, these are people heavily cited in my dissertation and subsequent research. So I'm just grateful to them all for participating. I'm also grateful to the Getty Foundation with their paper project initiative that really got the ball rolling on the exhibition and the publication, the Krannert Foundation, Delmas Foundation, J.B. Kaplan Fund, Consulate General of the Netherlands, Netherland America Foundation, Historians of Netherlandish Art, Association of Print Scholars, Northwestern Warnock Grant, and the Illinois Arts Council. I also have to mention the very generous lenders who made the exhibition possible. First among them is the Atlas van Stolk in Rotterdam, which after the Rijksmuseum has the second largest and most important collection of this material. And they lent things that I still can't believe traveled to Central Illinois. They were so generous. Also, generous lenders include the Hearn Family Trust, the Morgan Library and Museum, and the Rare Book and Manuscript Library here on campus. And of course, I'd like to thank my colleagues here at Krannert Art Museum. So first, I'd like to differentiate a little bit between the exhibition and the book because the two had quite different audiences and goals. The exhibition closed at the University of San Diego, but will be opening this fall at the Cummer Museum of Art in Jacksonville, Florida. The exhibition is intended for folks with no prior knowledge of Dutch history, of the early modern period, of printmaking. The intention of the exhibition is to illustrate the methods of visual communication used by these groundbreaking printmakers in the Dutch Republic, who weren't constrained by a lot of the trappings of artists working in countries that had a monarchy and thus more serious censorship. So I was trying to demonstrate the artistic innovation and breadth of political printmaking, not teach Dutch history. And I wanted to raise the profile of this neglected art form, especially works that incorporate text, because so often these are relegated to libraries and seen as works that are suitable only for historians and not art historians, when actually there's an incredible amount of artistic innovation, and some of them are quite finely made. And certainly because many of you are collectors and dealers, I'll mention that I did hope it would raise the value of this kind of print, because works that sell for more get more care and more study. So the exhibition was organized into thematic sections. This is the first gallery, and this theme was Dutch lions and other political animals. This was the section most popular with our K through 12 educators, and I'm sure you'll see why. So animal satire is a long-standing tradition in political printmaking. You can look to textual sources, things like Ovid or Aesop's Tales. You can look at animals' various associations that they have, whether that is thinking about a fox as sneaky or a sheep as weak, that sort of thing. And they're pretty easily understood today. You don't need a lot of context to understand the wolves getting in and eating the livestock while the shepherd sleeps. This is my favorite print from this section, and certainly one of my very favorites from the exhibition. This is one of the loans from the Atlas van Stolk. This is a reversed copy of Big Fish, Eat Little Fish by Bruegel. This is the one published by Hendrik Hondius in The Hague. And he has updated it to make it a commentary about political events. And in doing so, in order not to offend anyone, he's scribbled out his publisher's mark in the lower left corner. Although in this closed sort of political world of The Hague, this would have been recognizable to folks as Hondius's output, I think. But he's just added some captions and to make this a political cartoon. So he has added the names of folks in particular. So that says Barneveld monster, and that's referencing Johan van Oldenbarneveld, who's a politician that had been executed. And you see the Prince of Orange holding the knife of justice and gutting this big fish, with all of Oldenbarneveld's allies spilling out of the mouth. And basically, to sort of very simply sum up this history, This would be like if Thomas Jefferson and George Washington had been fighting in the early days of the Republic for power, and Washington had Jefferson executed for treason. This is essentially that level of political players. So Barneveld is publicly beheaded, and this is a commentary on him having deserved it. So the knife of justice is gutting him, and his friends with their names written on them are spilling out. A few of them are able to escape. We see, for example, Tyrannus, the little fish with legs, running off. So he's able to escape punishment, as are others. But that little fish with legs is in the original. So this is essentially a meme, essentially a 17th century meme. You have the Prince of Orange, Oldenbarneveld, these two political players, Johan van Udenbogart, the minister who's famously depicted in a beautiful portrait by Rembrandt. And we had the Morgans' gorgeous impression, Tyrannus, that little minister fish that runs away. And just by taking a recognizable image that's associated with the greedy and corrupt meeting a righteous downfall, you're able to make light of this very serious situation, and it becomes something that is humorous and readily understood. And so, like memes, I liked this one given the context today with this great image from Brokeback Mountain. We can take associations we already have, and the printmaker can very quickly take advantage of that as a visual strategy, visual shorthand to making their point and making it more funny. So while the exhibition was very much intended for the broadest possible audience, which meant that the labels would sometimes say things like the Prince of Orange, not specify who, or the Prince, or a politician, the book is very much a more scholarly and academic affair, although still hopefully accessible. It is gorgeous. Marcon Books did an incredible job. Our designer, Tom Eichmans, who has Dutch ancestry himself, did a beautiful work. And our publications expert, Katie Coca-Polite, also did a great job managing it. So it's a very beautiful book to look at. And you can still buy it. So if you're interested in this afterward, you can go to Artbook, our distributor, and pick up a copy. The book itself, the essays are not strictly tied to the exhibition. I wanted them to be as comprehensive and persuasive as possible. So it was great if folks wanted to use images in the exhibition, but it was not required. So in order to integrate the exhibition and the amazing loans we had better with the essays, there's 4 pages printed on this brown background rather than a white background with images from the checklist, which is in the back of the book. Often they are in thematic sections. So for instance, there's that portrait of Udenbogart, that minister who was on the little fish print swimming away. That's his portrait by Rembrandt with a poem by Grotius, who is also one of the fish in that print. And then next to it, a newsprint, or sort of like a news reporting print made by Claes and Visscher, the great landscape printmaker and publisher, showing the forced exits of the religious group that he belonged to. So the book is meant to expand upon the range of subjects and dates and incorporate the exhibition, but really go beyond it. The book opens with a short essay that outlines the scholarship to date, and it's surprising to see how it's fairly recent, that for a long time, a lot of these images were seen as a historical source and were evaluated as to whether or not they were accurate. And really only in the early 2000s did you get a substantial number of scholars starting to look at these as propaganda. My essay is meant to be just sort of the who, what, when, and where, and why of political prints. The what is especially important because you could argue that a lot of things are political. So for my purposes, I defined it as prints of people, places, or events that are about the government, the military, or corporations. And these can be anything from very expensive, very finely made wall maps to an anonymous print that would cost roughly the amount of a beer in a tavern. So really affordable prints that would be consumed by certainly the middle class and some of the lower classes as well. These came from a variety of sources. Certainly they were sold in illustrious printing houses. You see on the left a painting that might have been a signboard for the Van de Venne brothers in Middelburg. Adrian van de Venne, of course, a very important printmaker and book illustrator and painter, and his brother. And you can see on the wall of their publishing house several of the portrait prints, political allegories, city views, and other prints hanging as sort of advertisements. And Jacobsz, an important author, is walking in the door with the mayor of Middelburg. So the well-to-do could go into fine printing houses and buy these type of works, but a lot of them are sold by these itinerant peddlers, which is what you see in the other image. So he's got a little basket and he's got prints hanging down the front of it. And there are peasants who are looking at it, and he's pointing out different things and explaining to them what's happening in the print. And that print is great because it has a dialogue between the salesman and these peasants. And he says, hey, you guys are my regular customers. Why have you not been buying? So we can see that they are, at least according to this type of narrative, being sold to lower class folks, but they're also being sung and talked about as by these traveling sellers who are walking around town, and being discussed in taverns and on barges and in other locations. There are also a lot of sources that show that they were regular household goods, that they were printed on linen caps used to line furniture, that a lot of these prints had multilingual text, so they were appreciated by an international audience. And we see identifiable prints both in some correspondence and documentation from the time, but also in other things like paintings and prints. So this is a tavern or bordello scene by Jacobsz on the left. And hanging on the wall in the back is an identifiable, very large print by Claes, Jansz, and Visscher showing the West India Company's recent successes in Brazil. So these were the kind of things that weren't just ephemeral, but people lived with them. There are only 2 surviving impressions of this print, but it's almost a meter square. So it would have been, hung on the wall until light and dirt damaged it, but a costly and finely made thing that celebrated Dutch power in the Atlantic. And Visscher was famously a spin doctor for the West and East India Company and was given insider information to make these sort of corporate and military kind of propaganda celebratory images. My essay also looks a little bit at the traditions because, as Armin mentioned, this doesn't spring out of nowhere. Certainly the German Reformation is an incredibly important tradition. So I don't have it pictured here, but there are the many-headed monsters, a many-headed depiction of Luther and sort of other sort of monstrous depictions in Reformation art, both of Luther and the Pope. And here you see a Dutch print on the left, an anonymous print, attacking the religious group that Utenbogart, the minister that we saw earlier, belonged to. And each of the heads shows, their greed, the sedition, the fraud, and sort of shows all the monstrosity of this religious sect. But this type of visual language is still very much alive, even with artists who don't know these earlier precedents. So I paired it in my essay with this print by Eric J. Garcia from Arbing Press from 2018 called Patria. And you see the pre-colonial, colonial, and American empires and sort of their religions and tools of destruction. And Eric came out for a really lovely panel with political cartoonists who, are the folks doing the work most similar to this now. And I asked him, have you seen German Reformation prints or any other prints where this is done earlier? And he said, no, I just thought it was a great way to communicate this. So even without knowing historical precedent, this is still the type of visual communication that has a lot of currency today. So Ilya Feldman's second essay deals with a number of broadsides she has been able to figure out were made by Crispin van de Passe the Younger. She is, of course, the main expert on the Van de Passe family, the dynasty. And so I think these would have remained anonymous if not for her expert eye. And most of these prints only survive in 1 or 2 impressions. So it's remarkable she was able to find them and group them together and figure out how prolific and significant he was for this genre. These are works also that are often not appreciated because they have an abundance of text. I'm showing you the image on the left, but the objects actually look like the image on the right. They do have an abundance of letterpress, which thus far has been an obstacle to their collecting by museums, except for a few notable Dutch examples. So this example, again, sort of visual storytelling, we have this princely dicing game. So they're holding, we see a Prince of Orange and the governor of the Spanish Netherlands rolling dice. So they're gaming to win this military stronghold. And all around them are various political and religious leaders of Europe, including the Pope, who are trying to counsel them. And we see the peasants and kind of rural inhabitants cowering beneath the table. Crispin van de Passe was really significant for sort of moving into this more serial narrative structure of political prints. And he was even later punished for one that went against the prevailing political party. And he just was too old for them to actually decide to carry the sentence out. But he was supposed to be banned from the Netherlands for 25 years. So people did take his commentary very seriously. The other essay that I wanted to talk about is Wolfgang Kilson's. Now, as Armin mentioned, he was responsible for Wolfgang was for the 1997 War of Images exhibition in Berlin, which is an incredibly important predecessor for my work. And he wrote a spectacular catalog, including an essay that is, this is a translation and update of that essay. Unfortunately, all too few art historians have good German. And so even historians of, I should say, even American historians of Dutch art don't always use the German sources to their full utility. So I thought it was really worth seeking out an English translation and update of this work, because it mines so many primary sources of diplomatic correspondence to specifically find mentions of individual Dutch prints. And through that, we see how significant they were for international relations, that other countries took very seriously what the Dutch did in these prints. And they weren't insignificant to relationships between leaders and diplomats in the countries they were in. So I think the best example of this is this image, which shows a Dutchman with an axe chopping the tails off of English dogs. And if you look at that little pile of chopped off tails, it's very Freudian. It's very much an image of emasculation. So this was extremely offensive to the English, especially the English royal house. I mean, the Dutch are basically saying that in having beaten them in Anglo-Dutch wars, they have unmanned them. And the English royals were looking for reasons to justify a new war with the Dutch, which was not popular. And they hired Henry Stube to write justifications for war in 1672 and 1673. And as part of those justifications, he reproduces this image pretty closely, trying to make the English aware of the fact that the Dutch are attacking them as a nation. They're attacking English honor so that they will support the royals in the war. So here we have an image being cited as a justification for war. And I think that it's difficult to imagine a print that could serve that could have that kind of power today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Daniel.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Maureen, for the introduction. My name is Daniel Horst, and I work as a researcher at the History Department of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. I am very proud to have been part of this project for a book on Dutch history prints, initiated by Maureen. And also, of course, very proud that this book has been chosen for the IFPDA Book Award. My essay in this book is titled Cartoons and Cruelties, Political Prints from the Critical First Decades of the Dutch Revolt. That is, and we're in the 16th century now, from the years 15 1580. And in this essay, I take a closer look at two different types of political prints. First group is the satirical and allegorical prints, which focus on political or religious issues in a subjective manner, in which we can characterize as propaganda. The second group is newsprints, which illustrate the same political or religious issues and events taking place in the land, but in an objective, in a neutral way. Here, in this short introduction today, I will limit myself to the first group of prints, which I will illustrate with a few examples. Maybe a few words about the making of these prints. The prints we know about today are only a fraction of the total which must have been produced and were in circulation. Much has been lost. We know from sources that mention specific cartoons and political prints that were being produced and sold that approximately 30%, so about 1 in 3, have survived. Two examples which I will show you today are at the opposite ends of this production spectrum. First, the woodcut, which we see here, was very cheap and fast to produce and could be printed in thousands of copies. An etching, which would have been much more expensive, in editions which would have been much smaller, limited to the hundreds. So let's take a closer look at one of these rare survivals, a woodcut from the year 1566, which has, as far as we know, which is the only, survived in only one copy, which is in the print room at the Rijksmuseum, and about which we are lucky to have a bit more information than as usual. What we know about the print comes from the arrest and trial of a Dutch printer called Pieter Warnersson, who worked in the provincial town of Kampen. When Pieter is arrested for publishing a pamphlet critical of the Inquisition, he insists in his trial, in his testimony, on his innocence by declaring that many of such pamphlets and images were being freely sold all over the town, so that he thought it was okay to do so as well. In his testimony, he describes 3 of these prints. One of them is described as showing the mass celebrated by wolves and foxes. Well, we can't be 100% sure that this is the same print, but the image fits the description. This, I think, rather charming little print with the title Mass of the Hypocrites, we see the title in Dutch and then French at the top of the image, shows the celebration of the Holy Catholic Mass, in which all parts are being played by foxes. A fox priest blesses the Eucharist in front of the altar, and there are foxes singing and playing the organ. Maker chooses to get his message across by using animal imagery to create a topsy-turvy world in which the roles of humans are played out by animals. And here it is a familiar and easy, recognizable way to tell the story. The contrast between the predators, the wolves or foxes, and the victims, the sheep, which are not pictured in this image, must have been well known. Wolves and sheep make up a traditional popular metaphor originating from the biblical parable of the Good Shepherd, and was already widely used in German Reformational iconography. The same topos is the subject of a very different kind of print, which you see here. This spectacular etching bears a Latin title, Ovile Christi, which translates as Christ's sheepfold. It is unsigned and undated, but its origins can be traced to the Netherlands around 1570. In my essay, I discuss this phenomenal print in a bit more detail because this is the first time the complete print is published. And because of its extraordinary scale, it measures 70 by 96 centimeters, so almost a meter wide. It is made up of 4 separately printed sheets pasted together to form one image. It's also unique because it has a mix of religious and contemporary politics. The print survives in 2 1/4 copies. The one I'm showing you here is preserved in an album in Heidelberg in Germany. There's also a complete copy in the collection in the Met in New York. And a 3rd copy is preserved only in a fragment, kept in the collection of the wonderful castle Vester, also in Germany. So what we see here in this print, in the central part, is Christ leading the flock of sheep out of the sheepfold. At the same time, the Pope and other Catholic clerics are trying to enter the building by climbing through holes in the thatched roof. Around this central theme, we see on the left more scenes of Christ as the Good Shepherd, guarding the flock, protecting the sheep from wolves, and giving his life on the cross. On the right-hand side, a bad shepherd abandons his flock when he's attacked by a wolf. Here we see a detail when we zoom in on the lower right-hand corner of the image. So far, we have been dealing with a fairly traditional religious allegory. But the key point, the essential part of this print, are the scenes at the bottom right. Here we see a group of spectators gathered around the shearing, slaughter, and burning of the sheep. On the left in this group, we can recognize the Pope and an Ottoman Sultan on horseback. On the right, 2 other prominent figures can be recognized. The standing cardinal with his hand on his hip is Cardinal Antoine Granvelle. And behind him on horseback is the Spanish Duke of Alba with his characteristic forked beard and wearing the insignia of the Order of the Golden Fleece. Well, a bit hard to make out, I think, here. This scene situates the print firmly in a contemporary political context. Both Alba and Granvelle are staple ingredients in Dutch propaganda in the 1560s and 1570s as instrumental in installing the Spanish Inquisition and tyranny in the Netherlands. So the contemporary worldly and religious leaders are portrayed as bad shepherds. Instead of protecting the sheep, the true believers, the Reformed Church, of course, the sheep have fallen into the hands of the leaders who, like wolves, persecute and kill them. Contemporary viewers would have recognized the burning bodies of the sheep and billowing flames and smoke from the executions of those burned at the stake as heretics in cities and towns throughout the Netherlands. So in concluding, I hope that these 2 examples have given you some idea of the scope and range of religious political propaganda prints produced in the Netherlands in the last quarter of the 16th century. Thank you. And I'll hand you back to Maureen, I guess.
And with that, we'll have our final author, Meredith Hale, talk a little about her essay.
Hi, I hope everyone can hear me okay. My name is Meredith Hale. I'm a lecturer in early modern art history and visual culture at the University of Exeter. And like Daniel, I was just very pleased to be part of this book project. Maureen was an absolute dream to work with. And then also very proud that this book won this award, which seems absolutely right to me. So with my essay, I had a particular question I wanted to ask. And it was about the relationship of Romeyn de Hooghe's political satires. And you see an example on the left. So we're talking late 17th century prints. So the relationship of these kinds of satires to the so-called golden age of political satire in England in the 18th century. The significance of de Hooghe's satires to the larger development of the genre of political satire has long been acknowledged by scholars, including by Gombrich in the 1940s. But the specific relationship between his works and those of, say, Hogarth or Gilray has yet to be explored in any depth. And of course, there is a key difference, and that is caricature. Caricature, or the distortion of individual facial and bodily features, is conspicuously absent from de Hooghe's satires. And to illustrate this point, I'm showing you on the left a detail of the print we saw in full in the previous slide very briefly. This is Romeyn de Hooghe's Epiphany of the New Antichrist of 1689. And I'm comparing this with one on the right, one of James Gillray's caricatures of former Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger. Gillray is, of course, famous for his exaggeration of facial features, and here it allows him to transform Pitt into a toadstool growing on a royal dunghill. In other words, a parasite dependent upon royal favor. In de Hooghe's satire, his three protagonists, Louis XIV, James II, and William III, whom I've labeled here, are identifiable not by individual facial features, but by their clothing, accoutrement, and the dialogue attributed to them in the text below the print. So all of de Hooghe's satires, like a number of the broadsheets that Maureen showed you earlier, constitute an etched image, an etched print above, typeset text below. Now, the context for this satire is William III's invasion of England, known as the Glorious Revolution, and King James's subsequent flight to France. And here you see a moment, a fictional moment in which Louis XIV and James II meet William III after his exile to France. Now, I'll just take a very brief moment here to emphasize de Hooghe's importance to the production of Protestant propaganda in an era in which religion defined a nation's character and key alliances. You'll have gotten this sense very clearly from the last two presentations. This print is one of a series of satires that charted the events of the Glorious Revolution, or the Dutch invasion of England, as they unfolded. From William III's invasion, his ousting of the Catholic King James II, and his assumption of the throne together with Mary, and his military campaigns against James II and Louis XIV in Ireland. And de Hooghe did all of this through elaborate compositions such as this one, and a virtuosic etching technique, which I unfortunately don't have time to talk about too much today, but I encourage you to look at further. So in the detail of de Hooghe's satire on the left, you see James II and Louis XIV wearing armor and draped with rosaries, pilgrim badges, and stoups of holy water. Here they represent a bellicose and superstitious Catholicism, while William III, in restrained civilian dress, represents a sober and judicious Protestantism. Although their dress and associated paraphernalia clearly distinguish these protagonists from one another, the treatment of their faces reveals remarkably little difference between them. De Hooghe has made some effort to convey emotion, so surprise or dismay, with the open mouths of James II and Louis XIV, and perhaps determination with William's rather static expression, but conspicuously absent are the distinctly individual features that differentiate the protagonists definitively from one another. It is this fundamental difference in the treatment of the satirized individual and how it has shaped the subsequent reception and classification of de Hooghe satires that I wanted to explore in my essay. The essay is divided into two parts. The first part looks at the classification of political prints in the scholarly literature, specifically the division between prints produced before the advent of caricature in the mid-18th century and those produced after that moment. Early prints, so pre-caricature prints, so you see an example on the left, are seen as embodying the so-called emblematic mode, which is characterized by the employment of emblematic motifs, complex multi-figured compositions, a disunified, non-naturalistic spatial temporal structure, and a particular way of using text and image together. And on the left, I'm showing you England's memorial of 1688 as an example of this emblematic mode. Among the emblematic motifs employed here are the heraldic shields of William III's European allies that adorn the tree in the center of the composition, the tree itself, which represents the Prince of Orange, and of course, the all-seeing eye of God in the upper right-hand corner of the composition. The complexity of the composition, made up of various disconnected groups of figures, symbols, text balloons, and a lettered key are also characteristic of the so-called emblematic mode. One scholar characterizes such icons and symbols as, quote, objective markers deployed by the printmaker to represent a picture of larger truth. So this is a particular mode that's characterized in a particular way over and against what comes after the advent of caricature. So by contrast, a print produced in the caricatural mode focuses on the individualism of its subject. Caricature prints are characterized as fundamentally subjective in nature. They present interested or partisan views of politics and are predicated upon the modern conception of a private, authentic, and natural self, which of course the caricaturist undermines. And on the right, I'm showing you an early example of the caricatural mode made by politician and amateur caricaturist George Townsend. This is his Cassius of 1756. This caricature features parliamentarian George Littleton, who is likened to Cassius, the Roman senator and general, who together with Brutus instigated the assassination of Julius Caesar. Littleton appears as an exaggeratedly slight figure with a lumpy and drooping profile, small eyes, and a wig that's receding to reveal his skull. This distorted physiognomy is used to suggest fundamental character traits, reflected here in the speech bubble, in which Littleton states, quote, I have a lean and hungry look. Now, the emblematic and caricatural modes are seen as distinct from one another and as representing two fundamentally different worldviews, the former reflecting an emblematic worldview in which meaning can be discovered through resemblances in the visual signs of the world, and the latter reflective of the emergence of the so-called modern self, a dualist self that acknowledges the difference between a public face and a private, more genuine self. In this view, caricature is the revelation of this private truth. So it's a very stark distinction between these types of prints, not only the way they're produced, but the way they are conceived and the roles they are thought to play in the development of modernity. This is, by necessity, a summary, of course, of a more nuanced argument. But what I wanted to do here was illustrate the stark division in the literature between early modern political prints and what we think of as modern political satire. Now, with this essay, I wanted to consider de Hooghe's satires within this broader historical narrative in order to get a sense of where they might belong, because for me, they don't sit comfortably in either of these categories. Now, the second part of my essay approaches this problem of classification from the point of view of reception. How did the contemporary viewer read de Hooghe's satires? Were they seen primarily as a series of emblems and symbols to be deciphered? And how important is the depiction of the satirized individual to the understanding of the work? And on the left, I'm showing you the print in full, which is a broadsheet again with the etching above and the typeset text below, and a detail of the print on the right. So here I'm showing you one of the earliest satires in the Glorious Revolution group, which was made in late 1688. The subject is King James II's wife, the Italian Queen Mary of Modena. The subject is her confessor, Father Peter, who was accused in Protestant propaganda of having fathered the Prince of Wales, who later became known as the Old Pretender. And here we see him sitting on the far right at the head of the table in the midst of what is clearly a sort of debauched feast. Now, as you might expect, there is a lack of documentary evidence regarding the reception of these prints. That's not surprising. But the accompanying text provides some information about how the satire might have been read. Unlike other of de Hooghe's satires, in which the text comprises a dialogue between the protagonists in the scene, here the text, remarkably, is a discussion between two viewers of the print who comment on everything from the print's iconography and its meaning to the skill of the printmaker, of the etcher. What emerges from this text is that allegorical figures such as arrogance and envy, and I've marked them with little red dots, on the screen, that these allegorical figures serve as important aids to interpretation. But unlike in England's Memorial, which we're thinking of as our sort of example of the emblematic mode, and it was produced the very same year that this print was produced, unlike England's Memorial, these allegorical figures are integrated naturalistically into the composition. These allegorical figures are engaged in the unfolding action alongside the feasting monks. Emblems and symbolic motifs appear in the same spatio-temporal register as the subjects of the satire. Thus, while these motifs belong to the same system of signification as emblems in England's Memorial, I'm showing you England's Memorial again on the right, they function differently. The texts in these prints also function differently. Banderoles within the space of England's Memorial label figures and convey parts of the narrative, while in de Hooghe's print, the dialogic text below the image explicates the whole, and in this unusual case, provides critical reflection on it. This comparison demonstrates that de Hooghe satires do not fit comfortably within the emblematic mode, exemplified by the print on the right. However, as we saw earlier, neither can they be said to employ caricature, the hallmark of what some scholars call modern political satire. Now, de Hooghe was, of course, capable of producing effective likenesses of political protagonists, and he used portrait likenesses in a satirical or political context in a series of roundels of 1672, and an example of one of these roundels is on the cover of this volume. He clearly chose not to employ likeness and its distortion in his political satires. So I've drawn two broad conclusions from this study. First, the reason de Hooghe satires feature neither individual likeness nor caricature has less to do with his approach to the individual and more to do with the kinds of comic traditions with which he engaged. Bergelian peasant painting, the Rabelaisian mock epic, and comic theater, all traditions that are based on types, the prince, the fool, the Catholic, as opposed to depictions of individuals. De Hooghe's satirical roundels, such as that on the left, belong to an altogether different visual and conceptual tradition, that of the commemorative medal, which, like caricature, is associated with portraiture. The second conclusion I've drawn from this study is that we need to nuance the narrative surrounding the broader development of the political print. The literature on political satire and caricature should be better integrated, and rather than considering the emblematic and caricatural modes as binary and opposed, they should be made broader, more flexible categories. Ultimately, in order to integrate Romeyn de Hooghe into scholarship and what we think of as the golden age of satire, so beginning with Hogarth in the 1740s, we need to expand the canon beyond typology and morphology to include function. For de Hooghe's satires were critical to the single most important political historical event that allowed for the emergence of the caricature of political figures, and that was the shift away from absolutism and towards the development of parliamentary monarchy, which encouraged the development of political parties and, in turn, factional politics. Romeyn de Hooghe should, in my view, feature alongside Hogarth and Gilray in the canon of modern political satire, because central to both phenomena, de Hooghe's production of satire on the Glorious Revolution in the late 1680s and the emergence of caricature in England in the mid-18th century, central to both of these phenomena is the increasingly factional nature of politics, which we still enjoy or perhaps don't enjoy today. Thank you.
As a reminder, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. And if you do need to leave us now, this program will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. But I will turn it over to Maureen and Armin with questions.
In terms of the question about the remaining East India Company prints, those really large prints that Claes, Jansz, and Visscher in particular made with multiple plates, the smaller individual plates are in many museums, but the ones with all the letterpress, all the plates of that specific example I showed, the only two complete impressions that I know of are both in maritime museums. One is in the Amsterdam Maritime Museum, the Scheepvaart Museum, and the other is in the Maritime Museum of Rotterdam.
And I have, well, I want to put on one point, Larry Silver actually just made more like a message, which is apart from congratulating you all for this achievement, he pointed out that, of course, as he says, you know, a caricature of Muhammad would perfectly capable in these days to maybe even start a war, or at least a NATO rejection. And I think that just reminds us all about, you know, sort of the actuality of the material that we are dealing here with a historic difference. Maureen, since you just also dealt with this rarity aspect, there is one question that came up in especially listening to Meredith's talk and her differentiation between the emblematic and the caricatural mode. And I think this is just, you know, just a general idea. I wonder, Meredith, can we actually go as far and say that this sort of individualized, what we'll now call more modern way of imagery in the 18th century maybe contributed to their popularity through the ages till today? I mean, the popularity of, you know, English caricatures, which are able to, there are certain elements in them which one is able to enjoy even without knowing the exact political circumstances. Whereas with the emblematic mode, and many of those images, which brings me back to this rarity aspect, which is really sort of like, maybe because, you know, sort of coming from the trade side, is always so fascinating. You know, these things, like the Hooghe was very, very productive, but not necessarily is prints today so incredibly, you know, common as caricatures, which of course were reprinted and reprinted. You know, of course there is this sort of connoisseurship distinction with the early coloring and all this kind of stuff. But overall, I think they're kind of like more commonplace than this earlier material. And the earlier we go, as Daniel's talk saw, we are just basically looking at material where we have 1 or 2 or 3 functions, which I think also makes, 1 or 2 or 3 impressions that survive, which makes that very, very important question of function that you addressed at the very end, I think, so relevant. Coming, like, say, from old German material, the Reformation period, we also have situations where the majority of broadsides, German single-leaf woodcuts of the Reformation period, thinking about, say, Krannert, for example, okay, they survive in fair numbers, never as much as Dürer, but do they survive? However, their function is virtually unreconstructible, because among, I give one example, which always comes to my mind, among all the surviving impressions of woodcut by Lucas Krannert, there's only a single one which survives with the original indulgence with which it was issued in letterpress underneath. So we are talking 200 plus prints times at least 10 to 40 surviving impressions. All of that together, we have a single print that actually has the contemporary text there. So we actually, again, always are in an area of rarity, which makes us very, very different. So come back to the question, you know, does it maybe, I mean, could that be at least an indicator why that stuff has remained popular? Because you can, it's relatable. That's a really nice contemporary term, without even having all the background knowledge. Whereas with this material, you feel like if you really want to get it, you really have to know what's going on.
Absolutely. I think there are a couple of things going on to do with the market, but as you say, accessibility is key. With Romeyn de Hooghe's satires and a lot of the material that both Daniel and Maureen were talking about, you have to read the print meticulously. You have to know all of the references for each element in order to put the picture together. And those references are very, very quickly lost over time, because the political moment moves on, etc. When we have a figure caricatured bodily or in terms of their faces, we can relate to that. Even if we don't know who William Pitt was and what his political situation was, we can still relate to the fact that he is being caricatured. We can see that and understand that. But key to the survival of this stuff, 2 different things. In the 18th century, when you have Gilray starting to produce prints, the market is completely different. Up to that time, up to, I would say, the 1730s or 40s. Political prints emerge as and when they're needed for a particular political moment. That would be the case with the Reformation. That's the case certainly with the Dutch Revolt. That's the case with the Glorious Revolution. You know, Romeyn de Hooghe doesn't produce these throughout his career. He produces them at a particular moment to serve a particular function. And it's not until really London in the 18th century that the market has its own engine, if you will, and is its own entity and becomes a kind of consistent commentary on politics in the same way that we think about perhaps political cartoons today. So there's a fundamental difference in the market that I think has a huge impact on how many of these things were produced and how many survived. The other thing that Maureen mentioned earlier is that a lot of the texts are cut away from these prints in library collections.
Mm-hmm.
And they certainly were with Romeyn de Hooghe, but particularly with, you know, the very fine and very rare and very expensive, you know, Reformation prints. A lot of times they wanted to be treated as fine prints, and so therefore your curators separated your text from your image to make them to be able to put them in the chronological category, for example. So there are a lot of different factors, but you're absolutely right. There is something about caricature that is much more accessible.
And so collecting and then this sort of like cutting the text off, which is true, like say for these Krannert things I mentioned, they survive as art, but no longer as in their function. And in that specific case, for example, if you talk about indulgences, that's what you really didn't want, because, you know, this was, you know, then the Reformation came and he was sort of in the heartland, and you really didn't want to have effectively showing the indulgence showing underneath, when at the same time you're doing 10 years later, you're doing a big pamphlet you know, for Luther against, you know, the indulgence selling Antichrist in Rome. So there was this kind of aspect there.
Exactly.
So and then it's too straight. And so basically it's not just a time difference, because if you look at any kind of developments, I don't know, like the 1968 revolts and stuff like that. So on one hand, you have the fine art, and that is the market, and the English caricature manages to have, you know, these sort of artist collectors, whereas, you know, you can have even in the 20th century, a political campaign or like the student movements and things like that, where there, of course, there are broadsides and sort of like quickly produce things, which now are also totally rare, even if our time difference is all about 20 or 30 years, unless there was this kind of the nerdy guy who took like everything home and kind of pasted it in his album, and then it survives. And if you're really lucky, you know, a library is sort of a research institute is picking those up, and then we just know, yeah, I mean, if he wouldn't have gone home, you know, basically before the drinking started and put it nicely in his book, these things would also not survive.
Exactly. And that's where the Atlas van Stolk collection is so important, because they were collected as broadsheets, you know, as propaganda sheets. Maureen can speak to this much better than I can, but and so, you know, you have less of this concern about making these things into fine art prints in that collection.
Yeah, there's an interesting question that came in from Bob Fucci. Hello to Amsterdam, I guess. Is it possible to address the issue of impact? Is there a way to measure the effectiveness of any of these works as propaganda, or did they serve more as polarizing material than is now? Anyone would like to pick that one up?
I would. Hi, Rob. Yeah, I think there's a couple ways you can measure it. Government action against printmakers is one. And we see that with Daniel's discussion of the prosecution of certain publishers selling material, with Ilia Veldman's example that she's written about of Van de Posse being banished from Holland for 25 years and fined a great deal of money. Prints depicting Olden Barneveld, the executed politician, are banned 6 months after his death to keep peace in the land. So they were causing political uproar. And I mean, just in general, Wolfgang's essay about all of these diplomats that are really angry about the prints and how they're being used. But in terms of a domestic example that I found really compelling and sadly relevant, there's a lot of broadsides that come out right after the De Witt brothers are murdered. So these Dutch politicians are, their murder is orchestrated by a mob, by their political opposition. And these broadsides come out very quickly. And one set of the broadsides basically says, oh, this is a grievous crime, but that's the minority. The majority say, They were treasonous. They were seeking to overthrow the legitimate government, and the citizens had no choice but to take things into their own hands. And this is an execution carried out by the people. It is the exact same argument that the proponents and opponents of the January 6th invasion of the Capitol are making, that it's a crime, or we had to do this because the government was so corrupt. And there's such a large number of these broadsides, and they're really quickly made, that you can see in real time the two parties trying to take control of the narrative. And the fact that they chose to do broadsides, I think shows that people found them persuasive.
Daniel, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think I should add. I'm not gonna get into January the 6th, but you do see that in Holland, in 1566 is a special year. It's called the Wonder Year in the Netherlands, and it's called that because there was suddenly among the oppression by the Catholic Church and the government, there was all of a sudden a new freedom to produce images and booklets because the censorship had been temporarily lifted. So you see an explosion of production of cheap printed matter, which is flooded onto the market, always sold, though. It's never, sometimes we think that these pamphlets or cheap woodcuts were used as posters and pasted on houses or strewn in the alleys in the dark. There were always something which you had to buy, often not for very much money, but you see this explosion of ideas of printed matter, followed only 2 months later in the summer by the iconoclastic fury, in which causes a clampdown immediately on all this the publishing of free ideas and free matters. So you see the rise of free matter, the clampdown by the church and the government, and the censorship, which is going on for the next few years. And we have in the, I think, 1570s, the list of prohibited books, which then also includes images, actually, for the first time.
Okay, great, thank you. And also thank you for pointing out the commercial aspect of, because that's also something that runs through. There is this capitalist aspect, that former president of the United States is, sort of petulantly whining that his mugshot is used for all kind of, memorabilia things on both sides, and that he doesn't get a cut that he is, sort of that this is kind of used. So you have this kind of thing. The commercial aspect is kind of there. Anne had an interesting question. Anne Leonard, hello to Williamstown. The labeling of all the figures with numbers and letters suggests that they would have not been recognized even by contemporary viewers. Does that suggest that they're circulated widely internationally, or was it just taken care that identities not be misread? So Meredith, you would like to maybe take that, because it has to do with sort of the different mode of caricature and that the emblematic thing where it needs the legend. At the same time, we do know, and it was said that often there are at least two languages there, often French as so the lingua franca to a certain point, plus the Dutch language. But you would like to elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I'm not sure we've really resolved it, but when I first started working on Romeyn de Hooghe, I really wanted these things to be circulating widely. I really wanted these things to be circulating all over Europe. And what we found is that they didn't circulate very widely. They're the odd examples of a single print in England, or these examples are discussed, I think, in Wolfgang's essay. But it's really a very few of them. The text that accompanies these images and these Romeyn de Hooghe's prints are very dense. All the figures exist on a sort of very shallow stage-like space, and every sort of space in the print is filled with something. So visually, there's a lot going on, and then often the text below is actually a dialogue between figures in the scene. So rather than a text that says, this depicts James II fleeing from William III, la-di-da explanation, it is a dialogue between James II and William III and Louis XIV, let's say. So part of the sort of labeling of the figures and connecting them to the text has to do with dialogue. So we can keep in mind who's saying what to whom. But it's a very good question. I think perhaps one of the others might want to say something on that too.
Claes and Visscher uses a lot of numbers to identify, and sometimes it's to make sure you don't misunderstand. Like his large city view of Amsterdam identifies a lot of the trading partners of Holland and the goods that they bring. So, for instance, someone from Guinea brings ivory and gold. So they can be used in that way. And sometimes it's a sort of sequential back and forth between the text and image, or dialogue, identifying figures in the image and the dialogue that they'll be having. So I think it just really demonstrates the kind of narrative relationship between the text and image that a lot of these printmakers rely on to sort of create a story that we're witnessing. So we have a question in the chat asking if there are any images, tolerant or not, related to Jews. And this is something I thought about when putting together the exhibition. And maybe Daniel can help me ponder. I almost included some images of the 17th century images of the Portuguese synagogue. And I think those are related to Amsterdam's sort of self-promotion as a place where especially folks with mercantile skills and financial assets are welcome. But yeah, I mean, you have Rembrandt's cooperation with Jewish folks, but I didn't see anything really overt, but maybe there's something I missed.
Say something about this. Oh, sorry, Daniel. Excuse me.
Sorry. No, yeah. Just a quick word. Well, what comes to mind, which is I'm sure you all know, there are the prints from Germany, 16th century prints from Germany, which are very well, which characterize and make fun and in a very serious way, and show, well, which is maybe here again a link to contemporary U.S. politics, murdering children for their own gain. But that's not the kind of material I've seen in Dutch political or religious prints.
How nice that we can always rely on the German to bring the anti-Semitism out to its worst. Sorry for being so cynical about it. Meredith, you had something else, sorry.
Sorry, just to follow up on the Jewish synagogue prints, which were produced by Romeyn de Hooghe. The mercantile Jewish community in Amsterdam was really important for Romeyn de Hooghe in terms of commissions. And they also supported William III very substantially during the invasion of England. So that, combined with the fact that the Catholic was really the target of all the kind of ire, those two things together mean that we really don't have those kinds of depictions that you might expect.
Great. And I think sort of looking at the time here, with no new questions coming up, Jenny, over to you to wrap us all up.
Thank you. Quite a place to end. Thank you, Armin Kunz, Maureen Warren, Daniel Horst, and Meredith Hale for that. We hope to see everyone tomorrow for our program presented by our friends at the American Print Scholars Association of Print Scholars. We have a program on contemporary Indigenous Australian printmaking tomorrow at noon. Hope to see you then. Bye, everyone.